Hey, 7th graders, it's Mr. Allen again with one of your flip lessons. We should have our two worksheets here. Both of them should be in your interactive notebook. All right, I got women's rights right here, so that is number 17. And then number abolitionist right here is going to be number 16. We're going to be working on abolitionist first. All right, make sure we're getting our notes and all that stuff taken care of. All right, but let's jump in. All right, get this up too. There we go. Alright, so abolitionist movement part 2. I'll be moving the camera around so we can get, so I can kind of try to keep it out of the notes here as best we can. Alright, so what was happening before the abolitionist reforms kind of peaked? And you can kind of see it in this map. Slavery is expanding westward, so anything on the map that is kind of yellow, orange, brown, or red means that those states have slaves. 10 means kind of a little bit. Orange means a little bit more, brown means a little bit more, and then red means most of the population is going to be slave. And you can see by 1860 that slave population has moved south and west. All right, and that's going to cause a couple of problems. Number one, that's going to cause a big problem because these slave states are being added to the Union, and it's going to upset the political balance of power that we're going to be talking about much later when we get kind of towards the Civil War. But just know that it upsets political power in our country. Obviously, as you can see by that map in 1860, all the states in the north no longer have slaves. All the states in the south do. That's going to be dividing our country right down the middle along geographical lines and along social and political lines. By 1860, the tensions that we're seeing both politically, both socially, sometimes economically, is leading to violence between anti-slavery and pro-slavery forces virtually everywhere throughout the United States. We get actual battles between these folks in the Kansas territory. We get slave resurrections and slave revolts in Virginia and in North and South Carolina and things like that. We also get riots in northern cities that are kind of against what is going on with the abolitionist movement. The overall goal of the we'll go down here. The overall goal of the abolitionist movement is obviously to abolish or to end slavery. You can see the anti-slavery fair there. Now, not all abolitionists agreed on how to get there. Some abolitionists said, as fast as possible. Some favored a gradual approach. Some favored, let's end slavery and then send all the African Americans back to Africa. Lots of different ideas there, and at these meetings, those different ideas would kind of come to light and be debated upon. And sometimes people's moods would switch. For example, a guy like Abraham Lincoln, lots of his different quotes would switch and things like that, or his ideas about abolitionism. All right, some key people. William Lloyd Garrison is the gentleman down on the left. He's going to run a very popular anti-slave newspaper called The Liberator. Frederick Douglass, a former slave, is going to write books and give very fiery speeches that are against slavery. His book, Life and Narrative of the Times of Frederick Douglass, is still widely read today, not only because of what he was writing about, but he is extremely, extremely well written. And that's in a time period where African American slaves were not allowed to read and write. Angelina and Sarah Grimke up there at the top, former two sisters who lived in the South and kind of developed anti-slavery feelings and pursued a lot of anti-slavery goals based on their seeing of what was going on with slavery in the South. And Sojourner Truth was a very outspoken advocate, abolitionist advocate, and former slave herself. Results and actions. By 1850, all northern states had abolished slavery. The slave trade itself was now outlawed from Africa, so any slave trading was happening within the United States. But by 1850, the northern states had all abolished slavery. Anti-slavery societies spread across the country, and so you'd get people like Frederick Douglass and Sojourner Truth traveling around the country giving anti-slavery speeches, not too much down in the South, for a variety of different reasons that we will get into in class, but a lot of these folks were trying to spread that message. Anti-slavery newspapers and books are being published. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. And the Underground Railroad system is going to help slaves escape to the north and then later into Canada. By 1850, we're going to get a new fugitive slave law that is going to make it extremely difficult to help slaves escape north. So they're going to go through north into Canada for freedom. And what you're going to see is a lot of the spots, and many of you may even have this in your own homes. Many of the Underground Railroad spots were along our area, our neck of the woods, due to the closeness to Canada, closest to available waterways, Erie Canal, Lake Ontario, etc., to help with travel. System for helping slaves. We have the Underground Railroad, as you can see here. A lot of different ways to get to the north, but by 1850, that wasn't good enough. You had to get into Canada, because even if you had escaped north of freedom, slave catchers from the south were getting paid a considerable amount of money to come to the north, and a variety of different systems were enacted to kind of talk about that, and we'll talk about those more next week to kind of help persist through the Underground Railroad. And as you can see, some folks even went south into Mexico and into the Caribbean islands to gain freedom that way as well. Try to slide so we're not in the way here. All right. Many abolitionists also helped create newspapers and books. You got to remember, this is time before videos. It's time before commercials and things like that. So the way to spread your word is through the creation of newspapers and books. So The Liberator was a newspaper by William Lloyd Garrison, very fiery newspaper. He was the guy who kind of wanted emancipation and freedom of the slaves right away, didn't want to wait around for it, thought give them all their political and social freedoms right away, and then we'll sort it out later. Frederick Douglass was a guy that he kind of sided with Garrison for a long time. They kind of had a falling out over some particular issues that we'll talk about a little bit later. But not only did Frederick Douglass produce his own autobiography, but he also, out of the city of Rochester, produced the North Star newspaper to promote anti-slavery causes. Uncle Tom's Cabin is kind of seen as it was one of the most popular books at its time period, only being outsold by the Bible, and it depicted the fictional story, but kind of a pretty true to fiction, kind of one of those based on true events type things, of a slave family and kind of many Northerners. That was their first delve into what slavery could be, and it outraged many people in the North who made them anti-slavery, also outraged many people in the South because they thought this was kind of an unfair look into slavery. All right, now let's look to the women's rights movement. So now we're going to go on to page 17 of our interactive notebooks and jot down our notes there. Move around here. There's a good spot. Conditions before women's rights. So women are going to have few rights in the 1800s. Women could not vote. Women could not control money or own property. If you were married, anything that you may have owned, which you really couldn't do, would go to your husband. So if dad had left you something in the will, that would go to your husband. If you were living in the house that you had grown up in that was owned by your father, when your father died or passed away, that house would be then left, if there was no other brothers, would be left to your husband. Domestic violence was not against the law. One of the things that we'll talk about is the rule of thumb, if you've ever heard that term. I try to not use it because it has kind of a very, very egregious background. So the rule of thumb stated that a husband or a father could physically discipline their wife or their daughter or granddaughter or whatever, as long as the object they were using was no wider than their thumb. So basically, not only did it state that domestic violence against women was not illegal, but it kind of outlined how you could do it. And this really upset a lot of women during this period. And, there was a considerable amount of men that were involved in the women's rights movement. Frederick Douglass was kind of involved in that as well. All right, many in the women's movement believed that their overall goal, was to get the right to vote. So if they could get the right to vote, they could get suffrage, they could go through and say, look, politicians have to start listening to us because now we can vote. The politicians have to now say, oh, maybe we should get those domestic laws off the books because 50% of the population can vote for me now. Maybe we should give women property rights because 50% of the vote can vote for me now. Women were not thinking that men were going to do this out of the goodness of their hearts. Women were very pragmatic in thinking, look, if we can vote, if we can say whether or not these guys hold office, then they're going to start listening to us. And they weren't really thinking at this point in time about women running for office, although that will come later. But at this point period, we get the right to vote. That is going to help them fight for all their other rights. All right. Some key folks that were involved in the key people that were involved in the movement are going to be folks like Lucretia Mott in the kind of right-hand corner over there, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucy Stone, Susan B. Anthony. The cool thing about most of these people is they grew up in our area. So Auburn, New York, Seneca Falls, New York, Rochester, New York. In this central western New York area was where kind of a hotbed for all this movement. We talked about that in conjunction with kind of that was also the hotbed for Second Great Awakening in the burned over district. We're going to take those reforming yourself and push that over into reform the different issues that we see in society. All right, so let's take a look. Let me see if I can get let's go down here. That's better. So reforms achieved. In New York, laws were passed that gave women control over their wages and over property. Massachusetts and Indiana are going to pass laws that allow for divorce. And that was, again, another thing that women did not have the right to do. They could not divorce their husband. Husband could divorce a wife, and you can kind of see the issue with that. If a husband divorces a wife, you've got huge issues because, remember, women can't own property or can't own money. So then they're left pretty much destitute. They have no control over their children and things like that. Elizabeth Blackwell becomes the first woman doctor. She was educated at Hobart College right here in Geneva, New York, and becomes the first licensed woman doctor during this time period after she was not let into various medical schools across the country. However, the women's rights movement, even though it really gets started in the 1830s, 1840s, we're not going to see that overall goal of voting for all women across the United States until 1920. States are going to give women the right to vote, Wyoming, 1880s, 1890s, things like that, but across America, not until 1920. So, Seneca Falls Convention, we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about this, probably on Tuesday of next week, is going to be produce the Declaration of Sentiments. So they put out a call and they say, we're having this women's rights meeting, and hundreds of folks show up. It's in Seneca Falls, New York, and it's going to produce this document called the Declaration of Sentiments, which is going to be modeled largely off of the Declaration of Independence, with a couple key differences. Number one, where the Declaration of Independence famously says all men are created equal, the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments is going to say all men and women were created equal. It models after the Declaration of Independence because we're going to see a list of grievances of everything that women feel the rights that they should have that men have taken away, and kind of the key right, the number one right demanded by women during the Seneca Falls Convention is going to be that right to suffrage or that right to vote. All right, two outcomes out of the convention, right? It's going to unite that women's movement around that key issue of suffrage. Are other issues going to be involved? Sure. There's going to be women that are concerned with a variety of different issues, but that number one issue as the movement as a whole is going to be to gain women the right to vote. All right, and then it's going to lead to more meetings across the country. Meetings are going to pop up just about in every single state across the country over the next, decades of years. And that's going to really spur the women's rights movement to go into further detail that we will talk about a little bit more in 8th grade with the progressive movement. All right, but that's our flip lesson for tonight. So make sure that you've got all of your information on your notes. Again, your notes should be located in your interaction notebook on pages 16 and page 17. If you have any questions, hit me up on Schoology. If you have any issues, hit me up on Schoology. Tomorrow we're going to check 13 through 17, make sure everything's in there. All right, take a good one.